In the lively streets of a small town, a stray dog with soft brown fur and kind eyes wandered the alleys and sidewalks. The townspeople, always bustling about their daily routines, often spotted him. Some ignored him entirely, while others gave him a passing smile, charmed by the wag of his tail or the gentle tilt of his head. But there was something unusual about this dog, something that everyone noticed, but few understood. Every morning, like clockwork, the dog would emerge from wherever he spent his nights and make his way down the main street. As he padded along, he'd pause now and then, sniffing the air or glancing at passers-by. His destination was always the same, the corner shop owned by a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Thompson. The corner shop had been a staple of the town for decades, known for its colorful window displays and the faint scent of fresh bread that seemed to linger around its entrance. Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a brisk demeanor, ran the shop with a focus that left little room for distractions. She was a fixture behind the counter, greeting customers with efficient politeness, but rarely engaging in idle chatter. The shop was her livelihood, and in the current economy, it demanded her full attention. The dog, whom some of the children had begun calling Max, arrived at the shop every day just after it opened. His arrival was impossible to miss. He trotted down the street with an air of purpose, a single, perfectly green leaf held delicately between his teeth. The sight was so peculiar that even the busiest townspeople couldn't help but pause and watch. Why a dog would carry a leaf was a mystery, but what he did next was even stranger. When Max reached the shop, he would sit just outside the door, the leaf still in his mouth. He'd wait patiently, his large brown eyes fixed on the glass door, as if willing it to open. When a customer walked in or out, Max would seize the opportunity to step inside. He'd approach Mrs. Thompson, his tail wagging slowly, and gently place the leaf on the floor in front of her. Then he'd sit back, his gaze expectant, as if waiting for a response. Mrs. Thompson, always engrossed in her work, barely acknowledged the dog. "Shoo, go on now," she'd say, waving him away with a distracted hand. Max would lower his head, pick up his leaf, and leave as quietly as he had come. The ritual repeated day after day, and though it caught the attention of many, it never seemed to register with Mrs. Thompson. To the townspeople, Max's persistence was endearing. Some speculated about the meaning behind his actions. "Maybe he thinks the leaf is money," one man joked. "It's like he's trying to barter." Others were less amused. "Poor thing must be hungry," an elderly woman muttered one day. "Why doesn't anyone help him?" Despite the talk, no one intervened. Max, it seemed, was destined to carry out his routine unnoticed by those who might have truly helped him. Then, one day, the cycle was interrupted by a chance remark. It was a bright morning, and the shop was unusually busy. Customers flowed in and out, filling the air with the sounds of conversation, jingling coins, and the occasional rustle of paper bags. Max arrived as usual, his leaf held tightly in his jaws. He waited outside until the door swung open, then slipped inside, his nails clicking softly on the tiled floor. Near the counter, a middle-aged man in a plaid jacket was paying for a loaf of bread. He glanced down and noticed Max sitting there, the leaf now resting at Mrs. Thompson's feet. The man chuckled, nudging the person next to him. "You've got to see this dog," he said. "He does the same thing at my shop. Comes in with a leaf like he's trying to buy something." Mrs. Thompson, busy bagging the man's bread, froze. She looked up sharply, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean, at your shop?" she asked. The man shrugged. "I've seen him a few times at my bakery down the street, and my brother said he does the same thing at his store. It's always the same, comes in with a leaf, puts it down, and waits like he's expecting you to give him something. It's the strangest thing." Mrs. Thompson glanced down at Max, who was still sitting patiently, his tail sweeping the floor in slow, hopeful arcs. The leaf lay where he had placed it, a vivid splash of green against the scuffed linoleum. For the first time, Mrs. Thompson truly looked at the dog. She noticed the slight gauntness of his frame, the dullness of his fur, and the way his eyes seemed to plead silently. Does he ever get anything?" she asked, her voice quieter now. The man shook his head. Not that I've seen. I think he's hoping for food, but times are tough. No one can afford to feed a stray. Mrs. Thompson's gaze lingered on Max as the man collected his bread and left. The shop was quieter now, the morning rush over. Max, sensing that he was once again being dismissed, leaned forward to pick up his leaf. For a brief moment, his eyes met Mrs. Thompson's, and she felt a pang of guilt so sharp it startled her. That evening, long after the shop had closed and the streets had emptied, Mrs. Thompson sat in her small apartment above the store, turning the day's events over in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of Max sitting there, his leaf carefully placed on the floor. For years, she had brushed him off, assuming he was just another stray with no real purpose. But what if there was more to it? What if the dog's daily offering was his way of asking for help? The thought kept her awake long into the night. By morning, Mrs. Thompson had made a decision. Things would be different, starting now. For the first time, she would truly acknowledge Max and find out what he was trying to tell her. The following morning, the soft orange hues of dawn painted the sleepy town as Mrs. Thompson prepared to open her corner shop. The early hour was quiet, with only the distant chirping of birds and the occasional hum of a car engine breaking the stillness. She moved through her routine with an unusual sense of anticipation. Her mind, normally occupied with inventory lists and customer orders, was now preoccupied with thoughts of Max. She had spent much of the previous evening reflecting on the stray dog's peculiar actions and the chance remark from her customer. Max's ritual, which she had dismissed for so long, now seemed laden with meaning. The realization had left her feeling both curious and guilty. How many times had she waved him away, never sparing a thought for what he might need? The idea unsettled her, but it also ignited a sense of resolve. Today, she would make it right. Before opening the store, Mrs. Thompson took a detour to the small aisle near the back, where she kept pet supplies. It wasn't the busiest section of her shop. Few townsfolk had pets, but she always stocked a few basics. Her fingers hovered over the items as she considered what to take. She finally selected a can of chicken-flavored dog food, a small bag of dry kibble, and a pack of treats shaped like bones. On a whim, she added a simple, well-worn blanket from the storeroom. Her heart felt lighter as she carried the items to the counter, imagining Max's reaction. By the time she unlocked the door and turned the sign to open, the sun had fully risen, and the first rays of warmth filtered through the glass panes. It was still early, and the usual hustle and bustle of the town had yet to begin. She stood at the counter, arranging the pet supplies within easy reach, and glanced toward the door every so often, waiting for the now familiar silhouette of the stray dog. Max didn't keep her waiting long. As if on cue, he appeared at the end of the street, the leaf once again clasped delicately in his jaws. He trotted with his usual purposeful gait, his head held just high enough to keep the leaf aloft, but low enough to give him an air of humility. His eyes scanned the street, wary yet hopeful, and his tail swayed gently behind him. Mrs. Thompson watched him approach, her heart beating a little faster. This time, she wouldn't brush him off. She stepped around the counter and moved to the front of the store, standing by the entrance. As Max reached the door, he paused, as if uncertain whether he was welcome. "Come on in, Max," Mrs. Thompson said softly, pushing the door open for him. The dog hesitated for a moment, his wide, expressive eyes meeting hers. Then, as if sensing the shift in her demeanor, he stepped inside, the leaf still firmly in his mouth. He walked toward her slowly, stopping a few feet away to lay the leaf at her feet. His tail wagged tentatively, as if unsure whether his offering would finally be accepted. Mrs. Thompson knelt down, careful not to move too quickly and startle him. "Well, look at you," she murmured, her voice warm and kind. "You've been doing this for a while now, haven't you? I think it's time we did something about it." She reached behind her to grab the can of dog food she had set aside earlier. With practiced efficiency, she opened it, the faint smell of chicken filling the air. She placed the food on a clean plate and set it down in front of Max. The dog sniffed cautiously at first, his nose twitching as he took in the aroma. Then, as if reassured, he began to eat with gusto, his tail wagging more energetically with each bite. Mrs. Thompson sat back on her heels, watching him with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. How had she missed it before? The dog's thin frame, his dull coat, it was clear now that he had been hungry, likely for some time. Yet, despite that, he had approached her with such quiet dignity, always offering his leaf as if to say, "I'm not asking for charity, I'm offering something in return." As Max ate, the sound of his contented chewing drew the attention of a few early customers entering the shop. They paused, watching the scene unfold with curiosity. One of them, a woman with a young child, smiled and leaned down to whisper to her daughter. The little girl, unable to contain her excitement, clapped her hands and exclaimed, "Mommy, the dog's eating. He looks so happy." Mrs. Thompson chuckled, glancing over her shoulder at the growing audience. "It's about time, isn't it?" she said, her tone light but meaningful. "I've been shooing him away all this time, and all he wanted was a meal." The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're doing a good thing," she said. "I've seen him around the neighborhood. Poor thing's been wandering for ages." Max finished his meal and licked the plate clean, his tail wagging furiously now. He sat back on his haunches and looked up at Mrs. Thompson, his eyes filled with gratitude. She reached out tentatively, letting her hand hover for a moment before gently scratching behind his ears. His fur was coarse under her fingers, but the feeling of connection warmed her heart. "There you go, buddy," she said softly. "You're welcome here anytime." As the day wore on, word of Mrs. Thompson's gesture began to spread. Customers who stopped by the shop shared the story with their neighbors, and by afternoon it seemed like half the town knew about Max's visit. Some people even offered to chip in, dropping off extra food or small donations for Mrs. Thompson to keep feeding the stray. By evening, Max was gone, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't stop thinking about him. She wondered where he went at night, whether he had a safe place to rest. The thought nagged at her, but it also fueled her determination to keep helping him. She resolved to have something ready for him every morning, whether it was food, water, or just a friendly pat on the head. In her quiet apartment above the store, Mrs. Thompson found herself smiling as she prepared for bed. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose beyond the daily grind of running her shop. Max had shown her that even the smallest act of kindness could make a difference, and she intended to make it a habit. It was an unusually quiet evening in the small town. The sun was sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. Mrs. Thompson stood behind the counter of her corner shop, tidying up after another day of business. The warm glow of the shop's overhead lights spilled out onto the street through the glass windows, a beacon of light in the approaching twilight. The day had been busy, filled with the usual stream of customers. But through all the transactions and conversations, Mrs. Thompson found herself distracted, thinking about Max. Over the past few weeks, her relationship with the stray dog had evolved in ways she hadn't anticipated. Max's daily visits, his gentle offering of a leaf, and his quiet gratitude had become a cherished part of her routine. She no longer saw him as a mere stray, but as a creature with a story, one she was determined to uncover. As she closed the cash register for the evening and began shutting off the lights, a soft tapping at the door caught her attention. She paused, glancing toward the entrance. Through the glass, she could just make out the familiar silhouette of Max, his ears perked up and his tail wagging faintly. But something about him seemed different tonight. Instead of his usual calm demeanor, there was an air of urgency in the way he stood, his body slightly tense as he looked at her. Mrs. Thompson approached the door and opened it cautiously. "Max?" she said softly, stepping outside. The cool evening air brushed against her skin as she crouched to meet his gaze. Max didn't have his usual leaf with him. Instead, he looked directly at her, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. He let out a soft whine, glancing over his shoulder as if beckoning her to follow. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, frowning. She had never seen him act this way before. For a moment, she hesitated. It was late, and she was tired from the long day. But the look in Max's eyes made it impossible to ignore him. He whined again, stepping a few paces away and turning back to make sure she was following. All right, she said, grabbing her coat from the hook by the door. Let me lock up, and we'll see what's so important. She quickly secured the shop, pocketing the keys as she stepped fully outside. Max waited patiently, his tail wagging once as she moved toward him. He turned and began to trot down the street, glancing back periodically to ensure she was close behind. Mrs. Thompson followed, her curiosity mounting with each step. The town was quiet at this hour, with most residents settled in their homes for the evening. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the wind and the rhythmic click of Max's nails on the pavement. He led her past the familiar streets of the neighborhood, weaving through alleys and side roads she rarely traveled. As they moved further from the heart of the town, the streetlights grew sparse, and the shadows deepened. Mrs. Thompson found herself growing uneasy as the houses gave way to open fields, and the edge of the nearby forest loomed ahead. The woods, dark and silent, had always seemed imposing to her. She hesitated at the tree line, glancing at Max. He had stopped to wait for her, his tail wagging with encouragement. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, following him into the trees. The forest was eerily quiet, the dense canopy above blocking out the remaining light from the setting sun. Shadows danced on the ground as the wind rustled through the branches. Mrs. Thompson stayed close to Max, her steps careful as she navigated the uneven path. He moved with confidence, as if he knew exactly where he was going. "Where are you taking me, Max?" she whispered, more to herself than to the dog. Her voice sounded small in the vast silence of the woods. The deeper they ventured, the darker it became. Mrs. Thompson pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the path ahead. The beam of light bounced off gnarled tree trunks and tangled underbrush, casting strange shapes that made her heart race. But Max continued onward, his focus unwavering. After what felt like an eternity, Max stopped abruptly, his ears pricked forward. He let out a soft bark, his gaze fixed on something ahead. Mrs. Thompson followed his line of sight and saw a faint shape in the distance. As they drew closer, the outline of an old, weathered shed came into view. It was small and dilapidated, with sagging walls and a partially collapsed roof. Vines and moss crept up its sides, and the surrounding area was overgrown with weeds. Mrs. Thompson felt a chill as she approached the structure. The air here seemed colder, heavier. She glanced down at Max, who stood at her side, his body tense but alert. He barked again, this time more insistently, and moved toward the shed's door. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as Max pushed it open with his nose. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her flashlight illuminating the dark interior. The beam revealed a cluttered space filled with broken furniture, rusted tools, and piles of old, dusty tarps. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint smell of decay. "Max, what is this place?" she murmured, stepping cautiously inside. Her voice echoed slightly in the confined space. Max moved toward a corner of the shed, his tail wagging slightly as he sniffed at a pile of tarps. He let out a low whine, pawing at the fabric. Mrs. Thompson approached slowly, her heart pounding. She crouched beside him, gripping the edge of the tarp. "Okay, let's see what you found," she said, her voice trembling slightly. With a deep breath, she pulled the tarp back, revealing a small, huddled mass beneath. Her flashlight illuminated the scene, and she gasped. Nestled in the corner were several tiny, shivering puppies. Their fur was matted, and their eyes were barely open. They let out soft, pitiful whimpers, huddling closer together for warmth. Mrs. Thompson's heart broke at the sight. She reached out, her hands trembling as she gently touched one of the pups. It let out a tiny yelp but didn't pull away. Max stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the puppies, his tail wagging slowly. "Oh, Max," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "You've been trying to help them all this time, haven't you?" She quickly shrugged off her coat and wrapped it around the puppies, cradling them carefully. They were so small, so fragile, and she couldn't bear the thought of leaving them here. Max stayed close, his eyes never leaving her as she worked to gather the pups. "We'll get them help," she said softly, her voice firm with determination. "I promise." As she stood cradling the puppies in her arms, she glanced down at Max. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a quiet trust that made her heart take. Together they left the shed, heading back toward the town under the watchful gaze of the moon. Mrs. Thompson didn't know what lay ahead, but she was certain of one thing. She wouldn't let these puppies suffer any longer. The walk back to town felt longer than the journey into the woods. Mrs. Thompson cradled the fragile puppies against her chest, the small bundle wrapped in her coat to shield them from the cool night air. Their tiny bodies trembled, and their soft whimpers tugged at her heart with every step. Max trotted alongside her, his head held high as though relieved to have finally shared his secret. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting a pale glow on the narrow path. But Mrs. Thompson's focus was entirely on the little lives in her arms. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, her thoughts were racing. She had never cared for animals beyond the occasional stray cat that wandered near her shop, and the idea of what these puppies would need was overwhelming. But there was no turning back now. Max's trust in her had been absolute, and she wasn't about to let him, or the puppies, down. When she arrived at her shop, the town was almost completely quiet. Most of the lights in the nearby houses were off, and only the faint hum of a distant car broke the silence. Mrs. Thompson unlocked the door with one hand, juggling the wriggling bundle in the other. Once inside, she turned on the lights and quickly set up a makeshift bed for the puppies, using the blanket she had prepared for Max earlier. She gently placed the puppies down, watching as they snuggled together for warmth. They were so small, their tiny paws barely bigger than her thumb, and their eyes remained closed, blinking only occasionally in confusion. She filled a shallow dish with warm water and set it near them, hoping they would be strong enough to drink. Beside it, she carefully placed a small amount of softened puppy food, breaking it into manageable pieces. Max hovered nearby, his watchful eyes darting between the puppies and Mrs. Thompson. She knelt down and scratched his ears. "You did good, Max," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved them. But now, we have to figure out what to do next." It wasn't long before the puppies began to stir. One of them, slightly larger than the others, let out a weak yip and stretched out a paw. Another followed suit, nuzzling its sibling as if encouraged by the safety of the warm blanket. Mrs. Thompson watched with a mix of awe and anxiety. She was no expert on animal care, but she couldn't bear the thought of these tiny creatures suffering any longer. The following morning, Mrs. Thompson awoke on the small sofa in her shop, having stayed up most of the night to keep an eye on the puppies. Max had curled up beside her, his leaf forgotten for now as he rested his head on his paws. The soft sounds of the puppies waking up roused her, and she quickly got to work preparing another meal for them. As the town began to stir, word of the puppies spread quickly. A few early customers noticed the scene in the shop and stopped to ask questions. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside, their curiosity piqued by the unusual sight of Max sitting proudly beside the blanket full of puppies. Mrs. Thompson found herself telling the story over and over, her voice growing more confident with each retelling. "They were in an old shed out in the woods," she explained to one customer. "Max led me there last night. I don't know how long they'd been there, but he'd clearly been looking after them." The story quickly spread beyond the shop, and by afternoon a local animal control officer arrived. The officer, a kind-faced woman named Susan, examined the puppies carefully. "They're dehydrated and malnourished, but they're resilient," Susan said, her tone reassuring. "You got to them just in time." Susan offered to take the puppies to the local shelter, where they could receive medical care and proper nourishment. But as the officer gently placed the tiny creatures into a padded crate, Mrs. Thompson felt a pang of sadness. She had only just met them, but the thought of letting them go was unexpectedly difficult. "I'll keep track of them," Susan promised, noticing the hesitation in Mrs. Thompson's eyes. "You can visit them any time, and if you're interested, you could even adopt one once they're ready." Max, sitting nearby, let out a soft whine as the crate was carried out to the animal control van. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside him, placing a hand on his head. "They're going to be okay," she said, more to herself than to him. "You made sure of that." Over the next few weeks, the story of Max and the puppies became the talk of the town. Customers came to Mrs. Thompson's shop not just for groceries, but to ask about the dogs. Some even brought donations for the shelter, eager to help in any way they could. The once overlooked corner shop became a hub of activity, and Mrs. Thompson found herself connecting with her neighbors in ways she never had before. True to her word, Mrs. Thompson visited the shelter often. Each time, she was greeted by the sight of the puppies growing stronger and more playful. Their coats, once dull and matted, began to shine with health, and their tiny tails wagged with newfound energy. One pup in particular, a feisty little one with bright, intelligent eyes, seemed especially attached to her. On her third visit, Mrs. Thompson made the decision to bring him home. She named the puppy Toby, and he quickly settled into life at the shop. Toby's playful antics brought new energy to the space, and customers couldn't help but smile as they watched him chase after Max or nap in a sunny corner. Max, ever the gentle guardian, seemed content with his new role as Toby's mentor, guiding the young pup through his days with quiet patience. As for the other puppies, they found homes within the community. Mrs. Thompson took it upon herself to vet each adopter carefully, ensuring that each pup went to a loving and responsible family. It wasn't long before the town was filled with stories of the rescued puppies thriving in their new homes. Max continued his daily visits to the shop, though his beloved Leaf was now more of a token than an offering. He had found his place not only in Mrs. Thompson's heart, but in the hearts of everyone in the town. The bond between Mrs. Thompson, Max, Toby, and the community grew stronger with each passing day, a testament to the power of kindness and the unexpected connections that can change lives. Years later, Mrs. Thompson would often look back on that night in the woods and marvel at how much had changed. Max's quiet persistence had not only saved the puppies, but had also brought the town together in a way she could never have imagined. And every time she looked at Toby, she was reminded of the simple yet profound impact of following the lead of a dog with a leaf.